Hi guys. Before we proceed to this video, we've got something very important to share with you. Neoliberalism, Inequality and Authoritarianism by Professor John V. Kofis is available for purchase. You can order it directly from the publisher Little French eBooks or through Amazon.
Hello. When President Trump became president, when he was sworn in January 2025, he made it very clear that he would pursue a unilateralist foreign policy, which historically, especially when we focus in the 1920s, after President Woodrow Wilson left office, and there were three successive Republican presidents in the 20s until FDR was elected in 1932. That was an era. The 1920s is known as in American diplomatic history, is known as the period of isolationism, a period when unilateralism prevailed, and the United States was especially preoccupied with geopolitical and geoeconomic issues in the Western Hemisphere, with a great deal of focus on Latin America. And one of the reasons for this was because World War I had taught American politicians, as well as business people, big business, Wall Street, that there was a great deal of demand for energy and for minerals, strategic minerals and energy. And Latin America is one of the richest areas in the world for both. Venezuela, which is going to be the central focus of this analysis today, has in fact the world's largest oil reserves. And periodically, there have been people in government, people on Wall Street who have made no secret that they would like that oil to be under contract with U.S. companies. In other words, the subsoil rights issue, the rights to what is underneath the surface of the ground, namely oil, is an issue that actually goes back to the interwar period. It was very controversial, even during the Mexican Revolution of the 1910s, between the United States and Mexico. The U.S. did not like the idea that the Mexican government wanted to insert in its constitution that subsoil rights belong to the sovereign nation and cannot be negotiated away. Obviously, there were large corporate interests that had their eyes on that. So one of the issues historically has been that Latin America is the provider of raw materials for the North American, for the United States economy, Canada, by the way, as well, but for the United States economy to run its manufacturing engine. Latin America was underdeveloped by two underdeveloped countries, Portugal and Spain. And then, of course, the Northwest Europeans penetrated Latin America economically, although there were colonies. Most of Latin America, with the exception of obviously Brazil, a very large part of South America, with the exception of the issue of political control, the fact is that economic control in Latin America was not under Spanish and Portuguese sovereign rights during the colonial era, but rather under Northwest Europeans. If you look at the economic history of Latin America during the colonial era, what you find is that the real exploitation, economic exploitation of Latin America, really was taking place by Northwest Europe, especially by the British. The Latin American raw materials, in other words, benefited the development of the English industrial economy. So the underdevelopment of Latin America helped to develop Northwest Europe. And in the late 19th century, after the Spanish-American War, very gradually, the United States began to replace the role, the traditional, the historical role of economic penetration of Latin America by Northwest Europe. US companies began to take an interest, and then they really went in there after World War I. And there were all sorts of deals that were signed for minerals and energy, and of course for mega agriculture, large agricultural plantations. The question, of course, today in 2025 is, what does the United States want with Latin America? Latin America is actually veering, it's leaning increasingly, even countries pro-US, even El Salvador, which is under a dictatorship that is pro-US by a man named Bukele, even that country is leaning toward China and sees that its future in economic integration is with China. So all of Latin America is looking to the China-led BRICS group. There is no doubt that in the last 30 years, China has made enormous inroads in Latin America. This is something that the United States is well aware of. And just like the United States replaced Northwest Europeans in the late 19th century and down to the interwar period through economic penetration of Latin America, the exact same thing is happening today with China in that role of replacing, gradually signing major contracts for infrastructural projects, as well as mega trade deals, everything from soybeans to minerals, with Latin American countries, Latin American governments. So you have a situation where China, using the muscle of the BRICS group, BRICS, by the way, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, that's what those letters stand for. China is indeed the new economic hegemon that is challenging the United States. The Trump administration came in, not that the Trump administration invented this, this is a bipartisan issue. The Democrats are just as concerned, have been just as concerned about economic penetration of Latin America as Republicans. This is not about Trump. But Trump came in and decided, with his unilateral approach, an isolationist approach of the style of the 1920s, three successive Republican presidents, to go ahead and invoke the Monroe Doctrine of 1823. James Monroe, I believe he was the 5th president of the United States, invoked this doctrine in 1823, which basically stated that the Western Hemisphere belongs to the Americas. And extracontinental powers, namely the Europeans, did not belong here. They should not colonize, they should not affirm any kind of hegemony in this hemisphere. And the statement, of course, as innocuous and as it may have appeared in 1823, became policy, a long-standing policy of the United States, which essentially Eventually, when the US had the industrial muscle and it developed a large naval force and a large military force and began to interfere in Latin America, this became a very important policy because the U.S. from the U.S.-Mexico War under James Polk in the mid 1840s to the Spanish-American War from James McKinley in the 1890s, late 1890s, to the CIA coups in 1954 in Guatemala, in 1973 in Chile with regime change operations engineered by the CIA, behind which was the CIA, the US has been the dominant political, economic, and military force of Latin America. However, the world is changing. The new world balance of power is being determined by the fact that China-led BRICS has a larger GDP, especially in purchasing power parity, than the G7 countries combined. So the United States doesn't have any card to play other than, that is, it doesn't have a stronger card to play, let me revise that, other than the military card. And it's playing the military card. It's back to what in the 19th century was called gunboat diplomacy, jingoism, the kind of diplomacy where you send in the Marines and this on to the 20th century until FDR, by the way, until the good neighbor policy. The fact that the Franklin Roosevelt administration used the term like good neighbor policy necessarily implies the United States was a bad neighbor before that. It's that simple. There was no doubt about it. At least for the Latin Americans, it was indeed exactly that, as president of Mexico in the late 19th century, early 20th century pointed out before he was ousted, of course, during the Mexican Revolution. Porfirio Diaz stated, Mexico, so far from God, so close to the United States. In other words, the hegemony of the United States was felt in Latin America, and they were well aware of who was the master of the Western Hemisphere. President Trump is going back to that model of the Monroe Doctrine, jingoistic politics, that is militarism, military solution politics, sending in the Navy, sending in the troops. The question, of course, there are a lot of questions here. One question is the United States simply trying to keep China away and consolidate power for itself in the Western Hemisphere, so that then it has this base, not just the US, but the entire hemisphere, in order to launch successful operations and impose hegemony everywhere from the South China Sea to the Middle East to the Black Sea. That's one theory. Is the United States interested in regime change? Because, after all, this was routine for the US. The US did overthrow governments. There is plenty of documentation in the National Archives of the United States in College Park, Maryland, to show as much, by the way. Regime change operations were routine. The United States would not tolerate regimes that deviated from the dictates of Washington, D.C., from the geopolitical and economic interests of Washington, D.C., of the United States, of Wall Street and Washington. Is the United States interested in sending a message by attacking, ever since August, 2025 Venezuelan boats in the Caribbean, is it interested in sending a message to other countries, Cuba included, Nicaragua, Colombia, Mexico? Is it doing this? Or is it simply narrowly focused on Venezuela, doesn't care about the rest of these countries? The answer, of course, as we'll see, is indeed that the United States is interested in the entire Western Hemisphere, considering, by the way, that for the period that the president has been in office, he has even declared a tariff war on the neighbor to the north, Canada, forcing Canada, of all countries, by the way, reluctantly to go to try to see what deals they can strike with China. Okay? So the fact is that this is a hemispheric policy. It's not just Venezuela. It's not just Venezuela. The question, of course, is it Nicolas Maduro, the president of Venezuela, who has been at fault for not willing to negotiate? Well, actually, he has been willing to negotiate. In fact, he has come to the point where he has put on the table a proposal to offer a large stake in the Venezuelan oil industry to American oil companies, not under their terms, by the way. This is about the terms of trade. Historically, the issue in US, Latin American economic relations, has been about the terms of trade. They sell, the United States sells high manufactured goods, finished products, buys low raw materials. This terms of trade issue has been one that goes way back to the 1950s, when this argument was advanced at the United Nations by Latin American economists. Raúl Prebisch, for example, the Argentinian economist, was one of those who made it famous, among others. So this is a very important issue, the terms of trade. Now, so Maduro has in fact put something on the table. However, the United States has decided they want him out. So regime change is indeed a reality, considering there have been press reports, New York Times included, by the way, that indicate the CIA has been engaged inside Venezuela to undermine the Maduro regime. Now, finally, we come to the issue of why the US itself says they're doing this. They claim, the US government claims, it's about drugs. I will, of course, provide some statistics from the Department of Justice, FBI statistics, independent United Nations statistics, to show that this is absolutely a fabricated argument that narcotics trafficking from Latin America to El Norte, as they say in Spanish, to the north, in other words, does not emanate from Venezuela, a tiny, tiny percent only. So narcotics trafficking is not at the core of this issue. Now, when we look at when we broaden this out and we look at Venezuela from 1999, I mean, this is a country, by the way, of 28 million people, by the way. And when we look at what has happened from 1999 to the present, in 99, Hugo Chavez left progressive populists took over. He rejected the neoliberal model, which was accepted at the time by other countries in Latin America, and the United States demanded. The US immediately accused Hugo Chavez of being pro-Cuban, of being pro-communist. And the fact is that at the time, there were some defenders, including from Bolivia and from Mexico. There were people who said, look, Hugo Chavez is trying to improve the living standards of the bottom of the population. Venezuela is a very rich country, by the way, not just in oil, although, like I said, largest oil reserves in the world, but in precious stones, in gold, in tropical fruit, in agriculture, in animal husbandry, in fisheries, one of the largest industries in fisheries. This is a country that is rich in raw materials, but it has a poor population. Hugo Chavez rejected the neoliberal pro-corporate welfare model of the United States that the United States was pushing, the Washington Consensus, basically. And he opted for a populist Keynesian model with some social welfare elements to it. That did not go very well at all. In fact, things got worse. Partly because, and I'm not going to blame just the United States, partly because the United States and Western Europe did go after him. They did undermine his regime, his economy. They imposed all kinds of restrictions on his economy. And so the regime had very limited success. In fact, things didn't go well. After he was finished, he died. Nicolas Maduro took over in 2014. Sorry, in 2014, and he's been president ever since then. Maduro actually is not as radical in terms of left-wing progressive views as Chavez, but the United States continued to go after him as well. One of the big controversies with Maduro was that right along the border of Guyana and Venezuela, there have been, this is for some time now, there have been findings of very large oil reserves. Venezuela claims them, Guyana claims them. The United States is on the side, and Europeans, of course, on the side of Guyana against Venezuela. So Venezuela is identified with Nicaragua, it's identified with Cuba. It's one of these rogue Latin American states, according to the United States. Has the Chavez-Maduro regime yielded results for the Venezuelan people? No. Honestly, one cannot find statistics that would support this. Are they in favor of national sovereignty, greater respect for Venezuelan rights versus a semi-colonial status that existed before Chavez? Absolutely. But did the economic policies yield results to improve living standards? Statistics do not bear this out, namely statistics that the United Nations keeps that are very reliable. 28 million people, roughly 7 million have fled, by the way, in the last 25, 26 years. So this is not a good statistic to have that kind of movement of population out of the economy. You have an economy here of roughly 108, 110 billion in purchasing power parity, 225 billion. Country ranks 77th in the world. However, it is one of the poorest in the Western Hemisphere. It's not the poorest. Haiti has that distinction. Haiti, the small island, Caribbean island country, is the poorest. Now, considering Venezuela is so rich in resources, natural resources, from land to fisheries to precious metals to oil, considering it has all of that, it should not have poverty rates that are, according to different sources, by the way. Anyone runs a search and artificial intelligence search on poverty rates in Venezuela, you'll get every number from 35% and up, all the way up to 80%. Let's just say somewhere in the 50s, half the population. This is not a very good situation. We have another problem. The fact is that because of inflation running in this year, in 2025, 255% inflation rate. One result because of the inflation rate is that a large segment of the entire labor force is in the subterranean economy or the informal economy. This means the government pays the price because they evade paying taxes. They're outside the mainstream economy, and this doesn't help either. Another issue along these lines is the inequality. There's large, not that there would be equality anywhere in Latin America, any more than in the United States, by the way, but it's even worse in Latin America. There's a very small elite class of very wealthy people who own 70 to 100 times more wealth than the bottom echelons of society. So the Hugo Chavez, Nicolas Maduro era of roughly 25, 26 years really has not, you can't really say, well, here's a success story. It isn't. Now, it is true that Venezuela is not on another planet. It's on this planet, and this planet has a world economy of neoliberalism. It's the world capitalist system, and they operate within it. And within that system, they're at a disadvantage because the world's largest economy in terms of nominal value only, not in purchasing power parity, is the United States. And Venezuela is in the Western Hemisphere, and it has been disadvantaged by the U.S. sanctions, the U.S. Undermining its economy in Western Europe. However, it's not just that. There is indeed corruption. It is true that there is corruption. There is a patronage network. There are businesses. If you study what has been happening in the last quarter century, there are businesses that are linked to the state. It's sort of a model like Putin is running, not at that scale like Putin, but it's that sort of clientelist model that's at work here. So there is that. Now, on the issue of the United States claiming, well, this is a country that's run by drug lords, including Nicolas Maduro, who the president, who is himself linked to the drug trafficking. Well, according to the Department of Justice National Drug Threat Assessment Report of 2025, 92%, I repeat, 92% of illegal drugs emanating from Latin America do not come from Venezuela. They come from Mexico, through California, Texas, and Arizona. Okay, this is the Department of Justice that has issued this report. The Cato Institute, hardly pro-Venezuelan, by the way, the conservative Cato Institute maintains that 77% of drug traffickers in the United States are US citizens. It is no secret that the number one drug trafficking country in Latin America, flowing drugs from the south to El Norte, to the north, is Mexico. That's not a secret. People know it. You do not have to read the FBI statistics or Department of Justice report on national drug threat. Mexico is followed by Colombia, Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador. Those are the countries. It is a tiny percent that goes through the Venezuelan territory, and it comes from Colombia, and they go through it to the Caribbean. A very small percent, under 5%. Okay. So the question is, why has President Trump put a $50 million reward on the head of Nicolas Maduro, namely for his capture and delivery in an area where the U.S. can arrest him? The claim is that Maduro is the head of the Cartel of the Suns, as it's called, which is a term used for a group inside in the Venezuelan military, which the United States has declared narco-trafficking, which the United States has declared that narco-trafficking are terrorists, by the way. So that is the argument. Now, the question, of course, that came up at the United Nations when this issue arose by the UN Assistant Secretary General was, where is the evidence, if you have any, to the United States, to show that the boats the United States Navy has been blowing out of the water in the Caribbean are narco boats, narco-traffic boats, and that the people killed, or those, obviously you can't prove anything with them, they're dead, but those who have been captured are narco-traffickers. Where's the evidence? The US has not provided any evidence. The United Nations has issued its own conclusion that there is no evidence. Okay? Now, most of the United Nations countries, including, by the way, the two major countries in Latin America, Brazil and Mexico, these are the largest, strongest countries in Latin America, are on the side of Nicolas Maduro and argue that this is not an issue that the United States should be handling through gunboat diplomacy. A number of other countries at the United Nations meeting maintain that if there is a problem with narcotics trafficking in the Caribbean, and if indeed there is evidence Venezuela is involved, this issue must be handled multilaterally, not unilaterally, not blowing up boats randomly in the Caribbean, and then when asked to provide evidence, say, well, we don't have any evidence. But we know they're narco-traffickers. Even worse, when the Democratic senators, US Democratic senators, asked for evidence, they were not given any. When they asked to be briefed, they were excluded. Only Republican senators were included in the briefings about what's going on in the Caribbean and Venezuela. They excluded the Democrats. Okay. Even worse, the Democrats argued, okay, Venezuela is the enemy. What about the War Powers Act of 1973? Adopted, by the way, during the Nixon administration, because Congress wanted to make sure that the executive's authority was limited in engaging the country in these protracted wars like Vietnam. Where is accountability? You have to go before Congress, submit the evidence, and then we'll give you authorization to go to war. You want to go to war, go through Congress. And then, of course, through the United Nations. None of this. So this is random politics, to say the least. The question, of course, that has come up in a number of articles, journal articles as well as newspaper, is there a link between what the United States is doing in LA, first of all, in Los Angeles, in Washington, D.C., in Chicago? Now they're going to go into Minneapolis, Minnesota, in Portland, Oregon, going after Latinos immigrants. Okay, they call them illegal. They're undocumented workers. Fine, whatever term you want to use. The fact is that there are those scholars who maintain that there is a long-standing policy of racial discrimination against Latinos. And just like the United States is going after Latinos inside the United States and throwing them out, putting them in detention centers and shipping them to prisons and so forth in El Salvador and paying El Salvador millions of dollars to put them in prisons, okay, similarly, the U.S. has no respect for the sovereignty of Latin American governments like Venezuela, for example. It may not disagree with the regime, but this is a matter, as the United Nations debate unfolded, and it very clearly showed, this is an internal issue. The Chinese government has made it very clear that we do not interfere. We deal with countries. We do not ask questions about domestic politics. We do not interfere in the domestic politics. So China has a no interference policy. The United States does not. So this has not been lost on Latin Americans, okay? That there is a link between what's going on in the cities, in the major cities of the United States, from Los Angeles to Portland, Washington, D.C., Chicago, and hitting a Latin American country by a president, by the way, just for the record, who, by his own words, claimed that he is a peace president. He doesn't want to he never wants to get the U.S. involved in any kind of war. Well, this is an undeclared one. This is a war through covert operations and random bombings of these boats. And killing, by the way, the numbers change every day. It's in the upwards of 70 now, higher than that, actually, according to some accounts. So what we have here is what is the U.S. doing here? And the Trump administration and its defenders on television and in newspapers that are apologists for this sort of thing argue, well, you know, we just want to contain this problem of narco trafficking, okay? Let's look at the facts. The United States is roughly 4% of the population in the world. It consumes at least 12% of illegal drugs, at least. The estimates are very conservative. There are statistics that it's twice that. But let's go with a conservative statistic. No matter how you look at it, it's the largest statistic in the world. The U.S. has a lot of money. It's a rich country. It consumes enormous amounts of illegal drugs. So one issue is the demand side of the situation, and what is the U.S. government doing on the demand side of the situation? Well, what it has done is during the last 9 months, it has cut programs to help drug addicts, to rehab centers, hospitals, taking money out of Medicaid, so attack social programs. So if the issue is the drug problem, why undermine and undercut it from within? But there is a more sinister aspect to this. The United Nations keeps statistics about drug money laundered in the US banks and in European banks. The fact is that especially during the crisis of 2007, 2008, the so-called Great Recession, in other words, the very deep recession, which was like a depression, it is estimated that $1 trillion in drug money was laundered in European US banks. They took the money. It is no secret that a number of banks have been laundering money for decades now from Latin America. No secret. And the reason is the Department of Justice has fined these companies. Wachovia Bank, which was absorbed by Wells Fargo, was one of these banks. It's no secret that money, especially down in South Florida, but it's not just South Florida, in the western states out there, there is money in real estate that emanates through banks, comes from drug lords, drug trafficking. They launder money through banks, goes into real estate. This is a reality. Why not go after the banks that launder money? They launder drug money. Why bomb the boats in the Caribbean and do nothing about money laundering? The fines, the United Nations points out, the fines that have been imposed amount to less than 2% of the profits the banks make on laundering the money. Nobody goes to jail. So it's a profitable enterprise. So the hypocrisy here is very glaring. If we take out this issue of, well, drugs, if it's not drugs, and it certainly isn't drugs, then what is it? If it's not drugs, then it can only be other tangible factors. The United States is interested in the oil of Venezuela. It wants to secure oil contracts. Maduro, as I pointed out, has been willing to have contracts signed with US companies. However, not under their terms. Okay? If you study the history of oil companies and the percentages they took and what they gave to the host country where the oil was found, you will be amazed. It's only as we move forward in time that the host country gets a larger share. Okay, so this is a major issue, and this goes back to the 1920s, by the way, when they were signing contracts with energy companies, with oil companies. So the one issue is indeed the oil. Another issue, however, is the role of China, Russia, and Iran in Venezuela, as well as Cuba, Nicaragua, Mexico, Brazil, all of them on the side of Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela. So the question for Trump is the United States, will the United States allow China, Russia, Iran, Cuba, Nicaragua, Brazil, and Mexico to prevail over Venezuela and protect it in this manner, protect its sovereignty, or will the US prevail in determining what kind of regime Venezuela ought to have? But it isn't just Venezuela, because the United States is not exactly thrilled with the president of Colombia, Gustavo Petro, who is clearly on the side of Maduro and Venezuela. He is very much just like Brazil, just like President of Brazil, Lula, the President of Mexico, Claudia Sheinbaum. They're on the side of Maduro. So the US is sending a message to them, to Mexico, to Brazil, to Colombia, to Cuba, to Nicaragua, that the US will determine the type of regime Venezuela will have, and the US will determine the terms of trade in US Latin American economic relations. That's the message. And this sort of big stick diplomacy, early 20th century diplomacy, late 19th, early 20th century diplomacy, as it's called in U.S. Latin American relations, is really stretches the imagination to, and it makes one think, okay, what kind of regime does the U.S. want in Venezuela? It did have, for a long time, pro-U.S. regimes, and they were failures. They were basically regimes that supported a tiny country of very wealthy people. The majority were poor, and foreign companies. Well, it wants the kind of regime that it has in Argentina, that Argentina has, by the way. The kind of regime that El Salvador has. Argentina has Javier Milei, this neoliberal authoritarian figure who he has elections. It's hybrid authoritarianism because in the forefront are elections. Who is catering to the very wealthy. When you look at Argentina behind it, behind this Milei character, who is sort of a very theatrical individual, by the way, in Argentina, when you look at who is behind, it's multimillionaires and billionaires. The man he chose to go to Washington, D.C. and be the ambassador of Argentina is one of his millionaire supporters. The people that support him are millionaires and billionaires. And then he has Silicon Valley behind him. When you look at the support he has in the United States, it comes from Wall Street. It doesn't come from labor unions. He's against labor. He's against workers. That's the Peronist party in Argentina that supports the labor movement. He is pro-business. He is corporate welfare. Transfer income, transfer wealth from the bottom up. That's the policy. Use the state as a vehicle to transfer that income. That's the kind of government it wants, or a government even worse, El Salvador, which is openly dictatorship, by the way, and it has been used as a prison for the United States. It hosts prisoners on behalf of the United States, and U.S. is paying them, but it's also a country where it has, of course, been engaged in hosting a lot of crypto adventures for American billionaires linked to the government, to the U.S. government. So this is the kind of government it wants. It wants a government that will basically enhance the corporate interests of the United States and the geopolitical interests of the United States. It does not want a government that has a multilateral foreign economic policy, and it's looking to China and Russia and Iran, and it's looking to diversify. And by the way, I'm going to be completely balanced on this. The people of Venezuela are not living in Shangri-La in Venezuela. This is a poor country. Again, it's not the poorest by any means, but it should not be in this state. So this is not to argue that there is some kind of a regime of angels under Maduro. Not at all. It's just that what is to replace Maduro will be much worse, and that is the issue. Now, the question is what will become of this. There are a lot of people who believe that indeed the U.S. ultimately will succeed in getting rid of Maduro. It's trying to do it to intimidate him so he can leave, and so the U.S. can put someone in there that to their liking, like Javier Milei down in Argentina, or even worse, like Bukele in El Salvador. Okay, it may succeed, it may not. We don't know. We'll have to wait and see. But it's certainly trying to do that. It has sent a lot of military power down there, naval and air power down in the Caribbean to intimidate Nicolas Maduro and force him out. The question is, let's say the U.S. succeeds in doing that. Let us say the US succeeds in doing it. What kind of staying power, how sustainable would that dictatorship be? I used to teach Latin American history, and these dictatorships come and go, and the very sponsors of the dictatorships are the ones who ultimately undermine them and remove them, by the way. So the question is, even if the U.S. succeeds, how long before the U.S. gets uh, uh, disappointed with some policy that government will do and tries to undermine that new government that is installed? So the question is, besides the issue of respecting sovereign rights, besides the issue of respecting the United Nations, the process of the United Nations, and if there is a problem like narco trafficking in international waters and so forth, that this is done through multilateral channels. Putting all that aside, even if the U.S. unilaterally gets its way in Venezuela, this is a large country, by the way. This is not El Salvador. Um, how likely is it to sustain it? Colombia was under a pro-U.S. right-wing regime. Now they have Gustavo Petro, a left-leaning populist against the United States. So these things do not last. And it is detrimental and besides, by the way, it is detrimental to the interests of the people, of the working class and the middle class. I thank you for joining. I'm asking all of you to please sign up, write comments, and ask questions. I would love to hear from you. Thank you very much.